Mick Hucknall finally speaks out. It's time to expose everything. For decades, Mick Hucknall has been one of those musicians people think they understand. The unmistakable red hair, the powerful voice, the swagger of a frontman who seemed completely comfortable standing in front of thousands of people. But behind that image was a far more complicated story. A childhood shaped by family separation, years of being underestimated, explosive success, public criticism, relationships that became headlines, and a man who spent much of his life trying to prove that he was more than the image people had created around him. Mick Hucknall was born on June 8, 1960, in Manchester, England. His childhood was not the glamorous beginning you might expect from a future rock star. His parents separated when he was very young, and he was raised largely by his father, Reg, in Denton, Greater Manchester. That experience left a mark on him. Hucknall has spoken about feeling different as a child, and those early years helped shape the independent personality that would later become part of his identity. He was not born into fame. He had to build it. And he built it loudly. As a young man, Hucknall became fascinated by music and the energy surrounding Manchester's growing alternative scene. He was drawn to the idea that music could give someone a voice when ordinary life did not. Then came Simply Red. The band would become one of Britain's biggest musical success stories. But the story of Simply Red was never simply about catchy songs and record sales. At the center of it was Hucknall himself. He became the recognizable face and voice of the group, and with that fame came something every successful artist eventually discovers. People stop seeing the person. They start seeing the character. Hucknall's appearance made him instantly recognizable. His red hair became almost as famous as his voice. His confidence was sometimes interpreted as arrogance. His outspoken personality often attracted criticism, and his success made him an easy target for people who believed he had become too full of himself. But there was another side to the story. Hucknall had spent years fighting to be taken seriously. When Simply Red broke through, songs such as Holding Back the Years and Later If You Don't Know Me By Now transformed the group into an international sensation. Suddenly, Hucknall was no longer the young man from Manchester trying to find his place. He was a star. And stardom can be a strange kind of prison. The world tells you that you are successful, but then expects you to remain the person you were when you started. Hucknall didn't always play by those rules. He spoke openly. He developed a reputation for being outspoken. His personal life became part of the public conversation. And like many celebrities, he learned that fame doesn't just magnify your achievements. It magnifies your mistakes. His romantic life became a particularly visible part of his public image. Over the years, stories about his relationships and his reputation as a ladies' man followed him. Some of those stories became exaggerated in the public imagination. And this is where his story becomes more interesting. Because the Mick Hucknall people thought they knew was not necessarily the whole man. Behind the confident frontman was someone who had spent much of his life dealing with insecurity and the complicated need to be accepted. Perhaps that explains why he pushed so hard against criticism. Perhaps it explains why he refused to quietly disappear. And perhaps it explains why, even after decades in the spotlight, he has continued to speak openly about his life. The success of Simply Red also came with enormous pressure. The band sold millions of records. They played huge concerts. They became part of the soundtrack of people's lives. But success creates expectations. Every album has to succeed. Every performance has to match the last one. Every interview becomes an opportunity for someone to judge you. And when you are the face of the band, those expectations become personal. Hucknall experienced the highs of fame, but he also experienced its darker side. There were critics who dismissed Simply Red as lightweight pop. There were people who disliked his personality. There were others who judged his lifestyle more harshly than his music. But Hucknall kept going. That resilience is one of the most overlooked parts of his story. He didn't simply become famous. He survived being famous. And there is a difference. Over time, Hucknall began to speak more openly about the experiences that shaped him. His childhood, his father, his relationships, his career, the mistakes he made, the things he regretted, and the lessons he learned. That is why the phrase "expose everything" is so powerful when connected to his story, because the real revelations are not necessarily scandalous secrets. Sometimes the truth is more ordinary. Sometimes it is admitting that fame didn't make you happy every day. Sometimes it is admitting that you made mistakes. Sometimes it is accepting that the public version of you became larger than the real person. And sometimes, growing older means finally becoming comfortable enough to tell the story honestly. Hucknall also became a father, and fatherhood brought another perspective into his life. The man who once seemed obsessed with the excitement of celebrity life eventually had reasons to think about legacy. What would remain after the concerts? After the records? After the headlines? That question changes people. When you're young, you want to be noticed. When you're older, you often start wondering whether you were understood. And perhaps that is where Hucknall's story has reached. He no longer needs to prove that he can fill an arena. He already did that. He no longer needs to prove that Simply Red mattered. The numbers speak for themselves. What remains is the human story behind the music. A boy from Manchester who grew up with family complications. A young man who found freedom through music. A frontman who became internationally famous. A celebrity who discovered that attention can be both addictive and exhausting. A father who eventually had to look beyond himself. And an older artist who can now look back at the choices he made with a different kind of honesty. Maybe that's the real reason Mick Hucknall's story continues to fascinate people. Not because he was perfect. He wasn't. Not because he avoided controversy. He didn't. But because his life shows how complicated success can become when the world turns a human being into an image. We often look at famous people and assume they have everything figured out. But fame doesn't remove confusion. Money doesn't erase childhood wounds. Applause doesn't guarantee peace. And being recognized by millions doesn't mean you feel understood. Mick Hucknall's greatest achievement may not simply be the records he made. It may be the fact that he remained himself through decades of changing expectations. The red hair became iconic. The voice became unforgettable. The band became legendary. But behind all of it was a man who had to grow up, make mistakes, lose people, find love, become a father, face criticism, and eventually look back at the life he created. And maybe that's what exposing everything really means. Not revealing every private detail, but finally being honest about the person behind the celebrity. Because when the lights disappear and the audience goes home, the famous image disappears too. What remains is simply Mick Hucknall. A man from Manchester. A father. A musician. A complicated human being. And perhaps after all these years, that is the version of him worth listening to most.